Wow. It is great to be with so many friends, Young America's Foundation. You know, thank you for the very, very kind introductions. Thank you for the amazing boots. Those boots are awesome. I could not pull those boots off. I will note that you mentioned no nonsense. And, you know, sometimes in Washington there is a little bit of nonsense. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with the HBO show True Blood. I'll confess I am not a regular True Blood watcher, but it's a vampire show on HBO for those of you who don't know or are pretending for your parents you don't know. And if I were to sit down and make a list of all the places I thought I would never be mentioned, I have to admit HBO's vampire show would have to be pretty near the top of the list. And yet last Sunday, True Blood had an episode where some vampires go to a Ted Cruz fundraiser held of all places at the George W. Bush Presidential Library. And they're going in there to seek out and kill young Republicans. It's HBO. And so, not to spoil it, this is a spoiler alert, but the vampires go in and then the Yakuza comes in and shoots up all the Texas Republicans. This is HBO entertainment. Now I will confess that I saw that particular portion of the episode. I had to laugh out loud. And we did put up on Facebook a simple post observing. I said, you know, I was very disappointed to have lost the vampire vote. But I was astonished and fairly amused that HBO was suggesting that hardcore leftists are blood-sucking fiends. So we put that up on Facebook, got quite a few people commenting, and the very best comment came from one fellow on Facebook who put up a very simple comment. He said, "Ted, I'm sorry to tell you, you never had the vampire vote. Because vampires are dead, and everyone knows the dead vote 100% Democrat." So I read that on my iPhone. I promptly liked it, commented how great it was, and then we tweeted it out to the world, so we crowdsourced our joke. And indeed, talking about Twitter, another joke I just saw on Twitter made an observation about foreign policy. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel has the Iron Dome. And Vladimir Putin, well, he believes he has an iron fist. President Obama, he prefers a 5-iron. I wish that comment weren't so accurate. I wish that were more of a joke and not an accurate assessment of where foreign policy is today. You know, this gathering today is on the 50th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's Time for Choosing speech. "50 years ago, in 1964, President Reagan gave a speech that was a clarion sound throughout the ages. It was an indictment of big government and how it threatens our individual freedom. Now, Reagan's Time for Choosing speech went through the ages and laid the foundation for what occurred 16 years later. And what occurred 16 years later was the rise of the Reagan Revolution, the 1980 election that turned this country around. A Time for Choosing set the foundation for that transformational moment. And what I want to tell you today is just like 1980 was an echo of the wave of A Time for Choosing, let me tell you something. 2016 is going to be the second wave of the return of freedom to this country. It's striking to go back and look at what President Reagan said in 1964 before almost anyone in this room was alive, including me. In 1964, President Reagan, when he gave the speech, LBJ's Great Society was being born. Liberals were out to recreate the New Deal and to make it even bigger and more intrusive in everyone's life. And President Reagan said in that famous speech, "We were told a few days ago by the President, we must accept a greater government activity in the affairs of the people. They have voices that say the Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism." Another voice says, the profit motive has become outmoded. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or, our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded and that the NSA must intercept our cell phone conversations. That last part he didn't say. It was 64. They didn't have cell phones. But everything else he did. How many of those words could be said right now today? How many of those words are echoing from Washington right now? Concepts of freedom, individual responsibility, constitutional rights. You get a lot of politicians in this town who say those are outmoded concepts. Let me tell you, truth is never outmoded. President Reagan continued. He said, "This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are increasingly told that we have to choose between a left and a right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or a right. There's only an up or a down. Up to man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law. Or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. 1964 was a long time ago. 50 years ago. And yet in 50 years, those same words can be applied to what is happening in Washington, D.C. today. As we see the hand of government coming after our constitutional rights, coming down the Bill of Rights, one at a time, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the 10th Amendment. Or as President Obama calls it, the what? That same battle is going on. Do we think an intellectual elite, and let me tell you something, if you serve in Congress, they ain't that elite. As Reagan also said, it's not so much what liberals don't know. It's that so much of what they know just isn't so. If you look at where we are today on the economy, we are reliving the economy of the late 1970s. Since World War II, there are only 2 4-year periods where economy has grown less than 1% a year on average. 1979 to 1982, coming out of the Carter administration, the same failed economic policies we see today, out of control spending and taxes and regulations. And 2008 to 2012. From 2008 to 2012, our economy grew on average 0.9% a year. Right now today, the labor force participation is 62.8%. The lowest since 1978, since Jimmy Carter. 92 million Americans are not working right now. 92 million. We haven't seen that since Carter was in the White House. I'll tell you, there is one person who is thrilled about the job Barack Obama's doing, and that's Jimmy Carter. Today, the teenage unemployment rate is 21%. The African American teenage unemployment rate is 33.4%. An absolute disgrace. What we're doing isn't working, and every time we follow the policies of big government control of the economy, of regulations and taxes and hammering small businesses, what happens is opportunity dries up. What happens is people who are struggling, young people starting their lives, find they can't get jobs. And every time we get back to the principles that built this country, every time we get back to free market principles in the Constitution, every time we get back to tax reform, to regulatory reform, to pulling the boot of the federal government off of small businesses and job creators, the result consistently has been economic growth and jobs and opportunity. One path works and one path doesn't. And then there's foreign policy. In 1964, Ronald Reagan was not afraid to speak out against communism. He said, "We cannot buy our security, our freedom, from the threat of the bomb by committing an immorality so great as saying to a billion human beings, now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom. Because to save your own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters." I remember the 1980s, President Reagan having the courage to describe the Soviet Union as an evil empire, to describe Marxism-Leninism as a failed doctrine that will end up on the ash heap of history. He was asked, "What is your strategy in the Cold War?" He said, "It's very, very simple. We win, they lose." All of Washington tittered. That was so Philistine. It wasn't nuanced. It wasn't sophisticated. It didn't understand détente, which I'm pretty sure is French for surrender. And then the most important words any leader has uttered in modern times. When President Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Those words echoed throughout history. A couple of months ago, I had the chance to sit down with Natan Sharansky in Israel, famed Soviet dissident who spent years in the Soviet Gulag. Sharansky talks about how the prisoners in the Gulag would pass from cell to cell. "Did you hear what Reagan said? Did you hear what President Reagan said? Evil empire, tear down this wall." Let me ask a very simple question. Can you imagine President Obama uttering words such as that? What does it say? What does it say when the President of the United States either cannot or will not lead? When America retreats from leadership in the world and we have a vacuum into which step tyrants and bullies. And if there's one thing that's true, whether it's in junior high or on the world stage, it's that bullies don't respect weakness and appeasement. If you give them your lunch money once, they'll keep taking your lunch money. This administration is setting them up on a direct deposit. Today, just like 1964, just like 1980, is a time for choosing. Today, we've got a fork in the road. You know, if you look at the annals of history, they're inflection points. There are moments in time when the nation makes a fundamental choice that takes us on one path or the other. 1776, when the signers of the Declaration of Independence put their name on the bottom of that document, when they pledged their lives, fortune, and sacred honor. That was a fork in the road. It's a fundamental choice, and that wasn't meant figuratively. It was quite literally, they were declaring war on the mightiest army on the face of the planet. When this nation endured a civil war that ripped us asunder, and almost any other nation would have been permanently destroyed. We fought to come back together. We fought to correct and eliminate the grotesque evil of slavery. And we fought together to restore the unifying principles of this country. That was a fundamental fork in the road. In World War II, when America stood up to the evil that was the Nazis, that was a fork in the road for both America and the world. And in 1980, that election, we were at the edge of the precipice. We were looking down. It wasn't pretty. You know what? Across this country, there's some people right now who are demoralized, who are feeling down. They look at jobs and the economy, and they keep going away. They look at our constitutional rights, our Bill of Rights, and government keeps trampling on them. They look at the world. Is there a part of the world right now that isn't on fire with presidential leadership that is aptly described and self-described as leading from behind, which of course means not leading at all? And yet I'll tell you, it was just as dark in 1979 and 80. And the echo of Reagan's "a time for choosing" message resonated across this country. I want to tell you a word of encouragement. I am powerfully optimistic. I spend almost every day traveling the state of Texas, traveling the country. Everywhere I go, the same thing that happened in 1980 is happening again. In 1980, there was a grassroots movement. It came from men and women all over this country. It came from young people. Every significant change, almost without exception in human history, came from young people. Don't think this is an issue for your parents to worry about or for you to worry about in 10 or 20 years. This is your future we're talking about. The Reagan Revolution came from young people. It came from millions of people across this country who said, the path we're on isn't working. We want jobs. We want growth. We want freedom. We want the American dream back. The Reagan Revolution didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. In fact, I'll warn you now, if you see a candidate who Washington embraces, run the other way. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. Reagan had primaried the sitting Republican president, Gerald Ford. You want to tick off the establishment in your own party? Come within a hair's breadth of beating the sitting Republican president. That'll do it. It came from the people. It came from the people, and it swept this country back. We went from stagnant economic growth to, by the fourth year of Reagan's term, 1984, the first term, the economy went from almost no growth to 7.2% growth a year, to booming small businesses and jobs, to mourning in America. And we went from our hostages languishing in Iran to winning the Cold War and the Berlin Wall being ripped to the ground. That's how quickly things can change. And the reason I'm optimistic, the reason I'm hopeful, is because of each of you. Because the same thing is happening all over again. It's happening not in Washington. If you stay in Washington, you will be demoralized, dispirited, and depressed. And that's just Monday morning. But it's coming from the American people. It's coming from young people. It's coming from all sorts of people who haven't been involved, who are looking up and saying, we're going to take our country back. Do you know right now, for the first time in the history of this country, a majority of Americans think their children will not have a better life than they did. That has never been true in the history of this country, as long as Gallup has asked that question. Today that is true. Let me tell you something. What's happening right now, us standing together, is how we turn that around. And as Reagan said in 1964, together, we have a rendezvous with destiny. 2014, mark my words, is going to be an incredible year. We're going to retake the Senate, and we're going to retire Harry Reid. And thanks to the passion and leadership of everyone here, 2016 is going to be even better. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions you like. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Hillary Soleil, but I go by Sunny. I'm from the University of Louisiana Monroe, and I love you, and I think you're amazing. And so right now we have the U.S. Senate race going on in Louisiana, and we have two Republicans running against incumbent Mary Landrieu. One of those Republicans actually voted against you in the shutdown and voted to fund Obamacare, and the other had been endorsed by the Tea Party Express and Sarah Palin. And I just wanted to know, like every other young college Republican in that state, if you were going to become involved in that race.
Well, Hillary, thank you for this question, and I will say you really could make news with the reporters back there if the headline was, Hillary loves Ted Cruz. That would really confuse people in this town. Although I tell you, I'm far happier that you're Sunny.
Yeah, thank you.
Look, the Louisiana race, I think, is an incredible opportunity. It's one of the best pickup opportunities we have in this country. Mary Landrieu is actually a perfect example of what we see in Washington quite a bit. We see a lot of Democrats who, when they go home, they tell the voters back home they're conservatives. They pretend to be conservative. Mary Landrieu tells people in Louisiana she supports the oil and gas industry. Yep. Let me tell you something. Mary Landrieu has been lockstep with Harry Reid and Barack Obama on every major issue.
97% of the time.
And here's part of the game also. So in an election year, Mary Landrieu and a committee will vote for some pro-growth legislation in committee. There's one vote that Mary Landrieu casts every 2 years that matters more than any other, and that is the vote for Harry Reid as Majority Leader. Because as long as Harry Reid is Majority Leader, not a single piece of pro-growth legislation will ever make it to the floor of the U.S. Senate. So any votes she casts in committee are as meaningless and inconsequential as they would be if your kitty cat went in the backyard and voted in the backyard. In both instances, those votes have the same likelihood of impacting the law because Harry Reid will not allow him to come for a vote. So I think Louisiana presents an incredible opportunity to pick up that seat. I know y'all have a primary there. I know both of the folks there. I have, at least to date, not gotten involved in that. And I'll tell you, I've got a lot of faith in the grassroots. I've got a lot of faith in the grassroots. What I would encourage everyone from Louisiana to do is go and meet the candidates. Go and look them in the eyes. And the question that I would ask, I think the most important question to ask any candidate, is tell me your record. Don't give me a good speech. Tell me when you've stood up and fought and defended conservative principles. Show me. And I think if Louisiana voters do that, I trust the decision of the grassroots in Louisiana to come to the right choice. And the one thing I'm certain of is that the right choice ain't Mary Landrieu.
And can I have a hug?
Now that is a first. In Washington, sometimes people ask you for a hug, but it's usually because that's the best angle to put the knife in.
We were just saying that Hillary hugs Cruz is probably the better headline.
There we go.
I'm Joe Lanoy. I'm from Brandeis University. My first assignment there was analyzing Medellin versus Texas. I would love to hear your opinions and arguments on that because you got me my first day, so thank you.
Well, fantastic. I'm happy to talk about it. Medellin was the biggest fight I had before the U.S. Senate. And I spent 5.5 years, I was the Solicitor General of Texas, so represented Texas in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Medellin case began with a really horrific crime in my hometown of Houston where 2 teenage girls were horribly attacked and murdered by a gang. And the case took a very strange turn because the World Court, the judicial arm of the United Nations, issued an order to the United States to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country. First time in history a foreign court has ever tried to bind the U.S. justice system. And I'll tell you, the case took an even stranger turn because the President of the United States, who happened to be George W. Bush at the time, signed an order that attempted to order the state courts to obey the World Court. And so Texas found ourselves in an interesting position. Needless to say, it is an unusual position for the state of Texas to stand up to the President of the United States, who happened to be a Texan, who happened to be a Republican, who happened to be a friend. And yet I was very proud that the state of Texas went before the U.S. Supreme Court. I argued the case twice in front of the Supreme Court. And we argued, number one, the World Court has no authority whatsoever to bind the U.S. justice system. And number two, the President of the United States has no authority whatsoever to give up U.S. sovereignty. And I'm happy to tell you the United States Supreme Court agreed 6-3 and struck down the World Court's order and struck down the President's order. And I'll make a final point on Medellin. It's if you're interested in international law, in sovereignty, it's a fascinating case. But I'll make one additional point. There are a lot of things to be very troubled with about what's happening in Washington, but right at the top of the list is the lawlessness from the Obama administration. Is the abuse of power, is the assault on our constitutional rights. And I'll tell you a question that I keep asking more and more. Where are the Democrats? Is there not one Democrat? There are 55 in the Senate. Can you not find one who says enough is enough? Can you not find one Democrat who goes to the floor of the Senate and said, I'm fed up with this administration's assault on religious liberty. I'm fed up with this administration's assault on the First Amendment. I'm fed up with this administration's refusal to support the nation of Israel and embrace of the terrorist group Hamas. And Joe, I'm sorry to tell you right now, you can't find a single Democrat who will do that. And I am daily pleading for someone to remember their oath of office and stop just playing party politics and actually stand up for the Constitution and the truth.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Cruz, it's a real pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
My name is James O'Connor. I'm a rising freshman at the College of the Holy Cross.
Terrific.
I guess my question is, with all the crazy stuff that's going on in the world, particularly in Eastern Europe and Israel and Iran, you cited a lot of examples of Ronald Reagan's strength against global adversity. What would you do specifically, mostly with United States powers in foreign countries?
Right. Look, it's a terrific question. I'd say a couple of things. The first thing we need to do is we need to stand up and speak out for freedom. The United States has a unique position of a bully pulpit, and the words that come from the President of the United States matter. President Reagan demonstrated that. One of the saddest things is President Obama doesn't do that. So when protesters stood in the Maidan Square in Kiev, protesting for freedom because they wanted Ukraine to be free and not subject to Putin's domination, they wanted to stand with America in the West. And I stood in the Maidan Square just a couple of months ago, where literally they were young people. It's a high school girl who took me around who was 16. She was one of the protesters. She walked me around. She showed me the bullet holes where over 100 protesters were shot by Army snipers. She showed me the bullet holes where friends of hers had fallen and their pictures were still displayed. The president should have spoken out and spoken out for freedom. Right now in Venezuela, the people, young people, there's a consistent theme. Change comes from young people. Young people are leading protests and the beginning of a revolution against Nicolas Maduro's oppressive socialism. Leopoldo Lopez, the opposition leader, was thrown in prison for daring to speak out for freedom. The President of the United States should stand up on the world stage and say, cancel the show trial that is being scheduled, free Leopoldo Lopez. Right now in Iran, Pastor Saeed Abedini, an American citizen, is serving 8 years in prison for daring to share his Christian faith. The President should stand up and say, free Pastor Saeed. But beyond speaking out, I think our foreign policy, just like Ronald Reagan, should be directly tied to U.S. national security interests. I don't think we should be invading nations willy-nilly. I don't think we should be engaged in nation building. It's not the job of the military to be producing democratic utopias all across the world. I think that is a mistake, and that is not the job of the military, but it's also not the job or role of America to run and hide and fail to defend our interests. So let me give you a specific example, because there are lots of parts of the world, so we can talk about all of them. Let's take Ukraine for an example, because Ukraine is a good example to use. I think after speaking out for the protesters, if Putin had still marched into Crimea and invaded Ukraine, I think we should have done several things immediately. Number one, I think we should have gone forward with installing the anti-ballistic missile batteries in Eastern Europe, in Poland and the Czech Republic, that were scheduled to go into effect, and that President Obama canceled in 2009 in an effort to appease Putin. Well, it's pretty clear that appeasement didn't work. And then I think number two, one of the things Reagan demonstrated, now look, Reagan was very reluctant to put young men and young women in harm's way. But he understood that there are all sorts of levers of power to resist bullies and tyrants. If you look at Putin right now, Putin's most effective tool of economic blackmail is energy, is natural gas. John McCain has a great saying for Russia. He says, Russia is a gas station with a country attached. Right now there are pending in the U.S. government 22 applications to export liquid natural gas. What would a strong president do? He would stand up and immediately approve all 22. Now, what would that do? That'd do three things simultaneously. One, it would in fairly short order, in 6 months to a year to 18 months, once the infrastructure was in place, begin to help liberate the people of Ukraine from dependence on Russian gas. And I want you to think, if you're in a very cold part of the world and Putin has the ability to shut off your gas and freeze your citizens, that's an awful lot of leverage that Putin uses for economic blackmail. So it would help the people of Ukraine and of Europe. Number two, it would impose meaningful costs on Putin, who is basically a petro-tyrant. He's using the revenue from this energy to fund his aggression. And number three, it would create jobs and economic growth back here at home. It's a no-brainer. That's the sort of U.S.-focused, affirmative leadership that is so needed in the world, and right now is so missing with President Obama.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. That was a very riveting speech. My name is Felipe Cuello. I'm what you would call an American internationalist. And I suppose my question is a continuation of the previous one. You used a very apt metaphor in the lunch money and the bully. Mm-hmm. And in this case, Crimea is the lunch money. It's quite sad, really, what's happened there. Inflation is sky high, and Ukraine is commonly known around Europe as the Texas of Europe. It should be very dear to our hearts.
Beautiful thing.
And I suppose what I want to ask you is, can we get you on the record saying, Mr. Putin, give back Crimea?
Mr. Putin, give back Crimea. And let me make a brief point. Why is it so unimaginable for President Obama to utter those words? I remember a couple of months ago, Jimmy Fallon had a great segment where Fallon had Obama calling Putin, and he's playing both in this segment. And so Fallon, as Obama, says to Putin, Mr. Putin, you can't force these people to take something against their wishes that they don't want. And Putin responds, yes, in Russia we have a word for that. We call it Obamacare.
Hi, my name's Dalton Miller. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and that's a really good segue into my question. You've been on the front lines fighting this awful law, and I just want to thank you for that. But my question is that will we ever see this law go down?
Absolutely yes.
Now, just give that
But let me explain why. Because it's dependent on each of you, and then I don't mean that to be Pollyannish. Listen, Obamacare is the most destructive, failed law in modern times. It's the biggest job killer in this country. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs, have been forced into part-time work, have lost their health care, have been forced to pay higher and higher premiums, or have lost their doctors. And by the way, there is no group that is getting hurt more than young people. One of the simple points of Obamacare, you want to understand Obamacare? It is a massive wealth transfer from young, healthy people to everybody else. And it's important to understand how that is the case. One of the provisions of Obamacare caps the premium differential based on age at 300%, which means you can't charge more than 300% based on an age differential. Now, let me tell you, if you're a 22-year-old man or a 22-year-old woman in good health, it's not all that expensive actuarially to provide health insurance. If, on the other hand, you're 61 years old and have significant health expenses, it's more than 3 times as much to insure someone at a later stage of life. So what happens with that requirement? They jack up every one of your premiums. For a 27-year-old man in the individual market in Texas, his premiums have gone up over 70%. And basically it's designed, how does the whole thing work? Let's get a bunch of young people who aren't paying all that much attention is their assumption. And let's get them to subsidize everyone else. You know, I mentioned the late-night comics. I mentioned before Jimmy Fallon. Jimmy Kimmel has a fabulous segment on this. It actually, when young people come to my office, rather than explain it, I just turn on Jimmy Kimmel. They're happier anyway. They don't have to listen to me. But Jimmy Kimmel had this great fake TV ad of an older man and older woman, the sweater around their neck, and they're sitting there talking on the TV commercial to their grandson. They say, you know what? I'm 61 years old. I've got rheumatoid arthritis. I've got issues with this. I've got issues with that. And all of this stuff is expensive. But it doesn't matter to me because I'm not paying for it. You are. You know why? Because you don't vote. And we do. Ta-ta, off to the golf course now. Bye-bye. It's worth watching it because Kimmel communicates it more beautifully than anyone in politics can. So the question is, will we ever repeal it? You know, if you look last summer and last fall, as you all will recall, we had an epic battle to stop Obamacare. And if you listen to Democrats, if you listen to the media, although I repeat myself, they will tell you that effort didn't succeed. I'm going to suggest the proof is in the pudding. As a result of millions of Americans all across this country, millions of young people, millions of women and men standing up, focusing on the abject disaster that is Obamacare. We have seen President Obama's job approval ratings plummet. We've seen Obamacare's ratings plummet. We've seen it plummet with young people. It's gone from being supported to being opposed 2-to-1. We've seen it plummet with Hispanics. We've seen it plummet with independents. Now, all of that happened not because Washington showed leadership, but because the American people got engaged. And listen, some battles you can win with one clean rifle shot. Other battles take time, take building the foundation. I'm convinced that fight has laid the foundation. Now, we've got two more steps. We've got the 2014 election, and I can tell you between now and Election Day, we've got 98 days to go. I am working very, very hard to win Senate seats and retire Harry Reid. And then the predicate, if we're going to repeal Obamacare, and I'm convinced we're going to, it's going to come from y'all. It's going to come from the people saying, this thing isn't working. Let's start over. And I intend to do, let me say, 14 and 16. I think those elections should be about many, many things. They should be about freedom. They should be about jobs. They should be about growth. But they should be about repealing every bloody word of Obamacare. Thank you. God bless you.